Assalamualaikum. This topic is about enterprise JavaBean components, or also known as EJB. Okay, so these are the outlines of this topic. Define the JavaBean, okay, how to create the JavaBean, and describe the custom bean properties and events, and lastly, describe types of EJB, which are session beans, entity beans, and message-driven beans. Okay, so let's start. So what is meant by Java Bean? So Java Beans, actually we have touched it in the previous topic, is a reusable software component that can be manipulated visually in a builder tool. Okay, beans are regular Java classes. Beans may have a GUI or be invisible. Java Beans all Swing and AWT classes are Java Beans. GUI components are idle Java Beans. So enterprise Java Beans actually is a specification for developing large-scale distributed business application on the Java platform. Alright, so what are the features of beans? First, a bean class must have a zero argument constructor, which is also known as a default constructor. A bean class should have no public instance variable. Okay. The persistent values, either long-term storage or data, is not frequently accessed, should be accessed through methods, either accessor or mutator. Okay, so let's look at the Java Beans properties. A Java Bean property is a named attribute that can be accessed by the user of the object. The attribute can be of any Java data type, including classes that you define. A Java Bean property may be read, write, only, read only. Okay, and Java Bean properties are accessed through two methods in the Java Bean implementation class. Okay, so what are the Java Bean components? The classes that contain definition of bean is known as component of Java Bean. I repeat, the classes that contain definition of beans is the Java Beans component. So what are the classes? The classes are including properties, events, methods, and also persistence. So there are two types of components, which are GUI based and also non-GUI based. For example, JButton is example of a component, not a class. Okay. So let's look at the other components of Java Beans. The first one is the property. Okay, so for example, date members. Property is name attribute of a bean, including color, label, font size, display size. So it determines appearance, behavior, and state of a bean. So that one is properties. Second is methods. In Java Bean, the methods are same as normal Java methods in a class. It doesn't follow any specific naming convention, so you can name it as any name as you want. All properties should have accessor and getter methods. Okay, next one is events. So events in Java Beans are same as Swing or AWT event handling. Okay. And then the last one is persistence. So what is persistence? A serializable interface that enables Java Bean to store its state. So please remember, Java Bean has no argument constructor. Okay, so what are the advantages of Java Bean? So the first one is reusability in different environment. It can be used in any environment, in any application. So used to create applet, servlet, application, or other components. So Java Bean also are dynamic, can be customized according to the problems or the application that you want to develop. And Java Beans can be deployed in network system. Alright, so that one are the simplified or simple definition of JavaBean. And now we want to look at the description of Enterprise JavaBean or EJB. Okay, so EJB is a specification for developing large-scale distributed business application on the Java platform. The first EJB was released in 1998, and then, if I'm not mistaken, the most current release is EJB 3.2.3 and above, and has been adopted for inclusion in Jakarta EE, where it will be renamed as Jakarta Enterprise Beans. Okay, so let's look at the simple history of EJB. Okay, it has been generated in March 1998. Okay, then the first version is 1.0. Okay, companies such as Oracle, Borland, Tandem, Symantec, Sybase, and Visigenic, and many others, okay, has been applied EJB in their specification or in their application development. Okay, so let's look at the differences between JavaBeans and EJB. So Enterprise JavaBean or EJB was the first component-based development model for Java EE. It means EJB apply component in develop the application. So each of the function or methods or module that will be used or also that will be implemented in the application will be declared. EJB is similar to JavaBean in being component based, but that's where the similarity is, but that's it. Okay, so JavaBean is a Java class that encapsulates or used mainly for client-side development. However, EJB is a class imbued with specific server-side capabilities. It's what EJB is being implemented in server-side and used in large-scale business application and system. Okay, but not JavaBean. Alright, so the basic concept of EJB. So the idea behind EJB is to provide a framework for component that may be plugged into the server. So if we have an application and we want to add some more module or component in our application, so we may use the framework of EJB. Okay, so EJB is similar to the original JavaBeans, only in that it uses some similar concept. Means there is a few function that's similar with JavaBeans. Okay, so EJB technology is governed not by the JavaBeans component specification, but by the entirely different and massive enterprise JavaBeans specification. Okay, so what are the EJB goals? Okay, so just explain in brief. So EJB actually is designed to make easy for developers to create application whereby it freeing them from low-level system details of managing transaction, thread, load balancing, and so on. For example, if an application developers want to develop the application, so it can concentrate on application or business logic itself, but not knowing or no need to consider the details on how the data is being processed. Okay. And then second one, the EJB specification define the major structures of the EJB framework and then specifically define the contracts between them. Okay, so the responsibilities of the client, the server, and the individual components are all clearly being defined. So EJB aims to be the standard way for client or server application to be built in the Java language, which means if the developer wants to create an application, it has or it provides a standard way on how to create the application for client and also for the server. Okay. And then finally, the EJB is compatible with and uses other Java APIs. It can interoperate with non-Java apps and is compatible with Core Bar. Okay. So next one, we want to look at the EJB as components. So let's say we have discussed whereby EJB has several components that should be considered when we want to develop an application. So for example, in this application, it has register, student, course, trainer, support, and credit card that has been divided into several components. Okay, so the developer will develop different component or different module according to the function that they want to implement. Okay. So these components actually can be reused in other application if the application applies the same component that has been developed before. Okay. All right. So let's look at the EJB architecture, how an EJB client or server system works. So EJB architecture actually consists of three main components: EJB components, EJB container, and also EJB object. The EJB components will run inside an EJB container, and the EJB container will run inside a Java application server. Okay. So next one is EJB architecture, but this one we want to focus on EJB component. So an enterprise JavaBean or EJB is a component just like a traditional JavaBean. The EJB executes within an EJB container, which in turn executes within an EJB server. Okay, so any server that can host an EJB container and provide the EJB with the necessary services can be an EJB server. So any server that can provide the EJB services can host the EJB container. Okay, an EJB component is the type of EJB class most likely to be considered an EJB. So it's a Java class actually written by EJB developer that implements business logic. So in the EJB components, it has a business logic whereby to specify what are the rules, what are the function, what are the methods that we want to implement inside the component or to run the application. Okay. So what is EJB's container? The EJB container is where the EJB components live, means inside the container has an EJB component. So the EJB container provides services such as translation and resource management, versioning, scalability, mobility, persistence, and security to the EJB components it contains. Okay. Multiple EJB component instances typically exist inside a single EJB container. Okay. Alright. So what is EJB object? Client programs execute methods on remote EJBs by way of an EJB object. The EJB object implements the remote interface of EJB component on the server. The remote interface represents the business methods of the EJB component. instance, the remote interface does the actual useful work of an EJB object, such as creating an order form or deferring a patient to a specialist. Okay, actually EJB object, okay, consists of a remote, is a remote interface of the EJB component. Okay. Okay, how does the EJB's object works? The actual implementation of an EJB object is created by a code generation tool. So the EJB object's interface is the EJB component's remote interface. Okay. So the EJB object actually, which is created by the container and tools associated with the container and the EJB component, implement the same remote interface. To the client, an EJB object just look like an object from the application domain, such as an order form or any form that has been created or need the user to provide the input. Okay, but the EJB object is just a stand-in for the actual EJB running on the server inside an EJB container. Okay, so if you can see here, how does the EJB object works? Okay, so the object is actually inside the container. Okay, then we have client at the left side, okay, and the server at the right side. So client will request or enter some or give some input to the form, and then will be sent to the EJB server, which consists of EJB container and also the objects. So the EJB container will process the request by the client and access the data which have been stored inside the database. Okay, and then after the server has provided the data that has been requested, the container will process the data and will provide back or display the result to the client. Okay, so this is another example on how the EJB architecture or the EJB's object works, right? Okay, another example, okay, and then another example of how the EJB's object works in the client and the server. Okay, the client has the EJB object, which is actually the remote interface, and do some requests to the server, whereby the server consists of the container, and then the container will process all the requests by the client and do some analysis maybe or process, and then maybe need to access the database or call the persistence or data from the server and then give back to the client. Okay, so next one is the types of EJB. What are the types of EJB? Actually, there are three types: session beans, entity beans, and message-driven beans. Session beans are invoked by the client and make enterprise functionality such as transaction and resource management available to the client programmatically. Okay. And second one is entity beans. Third one is message driven beans. Okay, let's look at one by one. So session bean actually represent the business functionality that can be called by the client. The client in this case could be another class in the local JVM, Java Virtual Machine, or a remote call. So the EJB container manages the session bean lifecycle, which is determined by the bean state. So there are three states: stateless, stateful, and singleton beans. Okay, so what are the explanation or description or meaning of these three states? stateless session beans actually are similar to the request scope in the JavaScript API. Stateless session beans contain a chunk of callable functionality but are otherwise stateless. Okay, and then stateful session beans are associated with one client only and attached to the client's ongoing session. Okay, so it has a proper state and then focus on one client only instead of the stateless session bean, whereby it contain a chunk of callable functionality. It can be called in any time, okay, because is a stateless beans. Okay, what is mean by singleton beans? Okay, singleton beans are similar to the application scope in the servlet API. It exists only once for each client. Okay, example of the life cycle of session beans. The left one is the stateless and right one is the stateful. If you can see there, the stateful session bean is more complicated. Okay, and then it's only for one user. Okay, but not for stateless session bean. All right. It has several callable function which can be called in any time or in stateless time. Okay. Okay. So this one another architecture of session beans. So if you can see there, a client will provide a user interface some data, okay, such as credit card details for the payment, and then the data will be passed to the next phase or state, which will establish a connection to the session bean residing in the EJB container. And then next step, the communication is made with the help of technique called remote method invocation to handle the appropriate business logic, whereby let's say the client requests or send the credit card details to the server, and then the modules or the beans need to validate the data and do some interaction with the database to check whether the data that has been inserted or provided is valid or valid. Okay. So after the validation process has been applied or executed, okay, an appropriate response is sent to the client by the session bean in the form of a simple acknowledgement, such as a simple message, okay, or a data collection object or a simple object. Okay, so next one is an entity beans. What is mean by entity beans? It represents information persistently stored in the database. Okay, an example of an entity bean might be an employee object for a particular employee in a company human resources. So, in relational terms, an entity bean might represent an underlying database row or a single select row, which means entity beans represent or store a detail of an object. Okay. Entity beans replace the various sorts of queries in a traditional 2 or 3 tier system, and session beans do everything else. Okay. So every EJB has a unique identifier for entity beans. This unique identifier form the identity of the information. So for example, an employee ID might be used and unique identity for an employee object. Okay. A session based unique identifier is whatever distinguishes it from other beans of it. Like for example, the host name and the port number of a remote connection or a randomly generated key that the client used to uniquely identify a given bin. So entity bin has its own unique ID. Okay, so the figure actually demonstrates how the client interacts with the either session or entity bins. Okay, so the above one, the client connect with the session bin, and the bottom one is the client connected with the entity bin, right? Okay. So in this slide, it shows you some example on the implementation of the entity bins. Okay, let's say you are managing a shopping cart for an online store. So what are the requirements that you need to enter or insert in the form? You need to provide the identity of the customer or the shopping cart or the item, and then you need to calculate the price, okay, and many more. So these are the business rules or the data that is required in order to process the online bookstore. So with this scenario, the entity bin could do the following. So it could retrieve the custom information from a dependent persistent object. It could retrieve discount shipping and many more that required by the application. Entity bin not only retrieve persistent information from other objects but will also maintain its own persistent data and perform complex calculations. Okay. So the data is being stored into the entity bins, and the entity bins will be retrieved, okay, from the dependent persistent object. Okay, all right. So what is message driven bins or MDB? Okay, actually it's a message invoked via JMS or Java Message Service. Okay, and then message driven bins are not as commonly used as session bin, but they are powerful. Okay, being asynchronous and event driven, they are specially used for long running job where it is important to conserve resources. So between message driven bin and session bin, MDB actually is specifically for long running job or long process. Okay, however, for session bin is for a simple or short application process. Okay. So the simplest architecture of MDB could consist of the EJB application and its container and server, which coordinate with the message service processing the MDBs. Okay, so in development, all these components run on the same local machine. Okay, so this is the architecture of MDB. So let's say we have two application A and B. Okay, and then these two applications need a message broker to handle the message, right? Okay, so let's look at the difference between session bin and MDB or message driven bin. So as being discussed earlier, session bin is the most used in the EJB compared to MDB because of what? The architecture of session bin is simpler than MDB, right? So the major differences between entity bins involve a framework for persistent data management, a persistent identity, and complex business logic. So the interface requirement on entity bins provide callback function that the container calls when persistent data should be managed or when a bin should be retrieved based upon its identity. Okay. So this is the difference between the MDB and also session bin. Okay. Session bin has two states, stateless and stateful. Okay, and then the entity bin has its own structure, okay, whereby managed by the persistent. And then message driven bin actually is a synchronous communication. Means if you has a synchronous communication, better to use session bin and also entity bins. Okay, whereby if you have a synchronous communication, okay, better use message driven bin, right? Okay, so this slide shows you the example of EJB implementation. So as you can see here is the login interface. Okay, the user need to provide two input, which are username and also password, and then this data will be passed to the JSP file name receive.jsp. Okay. In this case, these two input will be validated in the receive.jsp. So in receive.jsp, all right, you need to declare a bin, okay, and then call the file, okay, pack.validate bin, okay, and then do some declaration for set property, okay, write some message that will call the get property methods, okay, in order to access the data of the uh, input that received by the user. And then last one, to tell the user whether he or she is valid or not. Actually, the data which has been inserted, whether valid or not. Okay, so let's look at the class pack.validateBin. So this is where the data is being validated. Okay, so receive two variables, user and pass. Okay, consists of constructor, setter and getter. Okay, and then another methods for setter. Okay, because we have two variables here, user and pass. So we have setter and getter for user and pass. So one method that will validate the user and pass data. So if the user and pass data is equals, okay, and then the message will be written as valid or else will be written invalid. Okay. So the rest of the slide shows you the example of EJB case study. So in this case is the online training application. Okay, join bought some methods or components from iByteCodes. The components are register, support, and validate credit card. Okay, and he develops another 3 components by himself. Okay, so actually the credit card component can be assembled in applications such as online shopping or airline reservation, online training, online bill payment, and etc. Which means the component that has been bought by John can be reused and sometimes can be replaced in many applications. Okay, not only for one application. So here, the slide that shows you the credit card component can be implemented in many applications such as online shopping, airlines reservation, online training, and online bill payment. Okay, so that's all. Thank you.